The sky above the neighborhood was cold, as if the morning itself knew that something heavy was hiding behind it. The leaden clouds brought no rain, but their shadow fell on the old facades like a premonition. Everything was painfully familiar. Pedestrians in headphones, rare cars, the morning creak of garbage cans, and the barely perceptible smell of last night's dinner from the open third-floor window. The neighborhood was alive, as always, but the silence that reigned in the air was different. Not calm, restrained, like a waiting room before an operation, like before a gunshot. An elderly woman came out of an old entrance on the corner of 7th Avenue with a slow creak of doors. Her movements were measured, with that grace that you do not notice at first, until you understand that there is neither haste nor fear in them, only experience. She held a thin, worn leash, and on the end of it trotted her old dog, a light brown mixed breed with drooping ears and a look as if he had seen too much. His name was Chester, and he was almost 15. He limped a little on his back leg and coughed occasionally, but despite his age, he followed his mistress, wagging his tail cheerfully. Mrs. Evelyn James, 74 years old, a little below average height, her back straight, as if she were still waiting for someone to ask her to speak at a community meeting, like in the days when her voice still meant something. She was wearing a neat beige jacket, a shabby shoulder bag, and knitted gloves. Despite the fact that it was spring, the weather was in no hurry to warm up. Her hair was grey, gathered in a bun, and her face was covered with deep wrinkles in which whole eras were read, not years, but entire eras. There was a silence in her eyes that didn't need words. She walked along the sidewalk, where the tiles were bulging from the roots of the trees, passing familiar houses and identical glances. People saw her almost every day, and almost no one said hello, not out of hostility, but rather out of indifference, or from an inner desire not to notice. People like Evelyn became part of the landscape. It was as if they had always been, and always would be, the shadows of the city, the background for other people's stories. But this time, everything was different. On the opposite side of the street was a patrol car, a police car, white with a blue stripe, slightly dusty. Inside, 2 people, young, both in uniform, both with cappuccinos from the local Marvin in their cup holders. One of them was thin, with sharp features and an overly confident expression in his eyes. The other was strong, with growing stubble and a contemptuous smirk. The radio was playing in the car, but the announcer's voice was barely audible through the closed windows. "Look at this," one of them said, nodding at Evelyn. "That witch and her dog again." The second one chuckled. "What is she doing out on the street at 6 in the morning every day? Like she has somewhere to rush." "You want a joke?" The first cop took out his phone and turned on the camera. "I'll record this for Rick now. He was laughing last time." He started filming. The camera captured Evelyn walking slowly down the sidewalk, her old bag, the dog, who stopped to sniff a tree. "Cool, let's call it Invisible Granny and Her War Rats," he said and laughed. Then he added in a fake announcer's voice, "On today's episode, a homeless woman is terrorizing the neighborhood with her presence. The crime rate has increased sharply since her arrival, by 0.0001%. Residents are in a panic." They both burst out laughing. The laughter was loud, rough, like a kick in the stomach. One of them, still holding the phone, opened the door and walked out. "Hey, Mom," he said with forced politeness. "You're not allowed to walk your pets here. There's a sign over there. No dogs on the grass." Evelyn stopped, slowly turned her head, looked, a second, 2. Then a voice, quiet, calm. "My dog's not on the grass." "He's being smart," the other muttered, getting out of the car. "I heard we're cleaning up around here, Granny. Maybe you should go home, or back to wherever you came from." "I live here," she said simply. "Oh, really?" one of them said mockingly. "On this street? What, 30 years? And you still haven't figured out that this is no place for your kind?" She didn't answer. "Where's the dog's papers? Are the shots up? Or are you both infested?" He came closer, leaned toward Chester, who growled softly, just a little, barely audible. The cop stepped back and pretended to kick him. "Just try it," she said, and there was steel in her voice that no police badge had. "Why are you so insolent, old woman?" One of them grabbed the leash. "Maybe I should take you to the station to quiet your mouth." The dog whined. Evelyn pressed her lips together. She glanced at the passers-by. People were hurrying past, not making eye contact. Someone quickened their pace. Someone turned away. One teenager even took out his phone and started filming. But when he saw the cop's gaze, he put it back. "I said, let go of the leash," she repeated. Calmly. Very quietly. There was an abyss in her eyes. The cop squeezed his fingers tighter. Chester whined louder. "Did you hear me?" She took a step forward. "One more step and you'll be resisting arrest," the other said, putting his hand on his holster. At that moment, something strange happened. The wind died down. The noise of the street became muffled, as if someone had pressed pause. It was as if time held its breath, and in that silence, full of unspoken words and naked humiliation, stood a little old woman with grey hair, a straight back, an old dog, and a look that would make even those who considered themselves the masters of the city look down. She knew this was not the first time. She had seen such faces. In the 60s, on the march in Mississippi. In the 70s, when her brother was arrested without cause. In the 90s, when her grandson was searched at a bus stop because he was too black for a good neighborhood. She knew this game, and she knew how it could end. But something had changed. They didn't know who she was yet. They didn't know that her name sounded so different to those who wore ties and stars on their shoulders. They didn't know that her story was not an end, but a prologue. Through the gathering shadows, through the smoke of humiliation and prejudice, something was beginning to build inside that fragile figure. Not anger, no. That had long since gone cold. It was different. It was a beginning. The city had not yet fully awakened, but the street already felt that someone was looking at it. Like skin feels a glance through a rifle scope, unconsciously at first, like a slight tingle in the spine, like an instinct familiar to anyone who has lived too long among those who consider themselves superior. Mrs. Evelyn didn't change her pace, didn't slow down, but she already knew. They were here. Two men appeared from behind, from around the corner, in identical blue uniforms, with walkie-talkies on their chests, with a step that sounded not of service, but of power. Young, in their 20s, both new to the station. They had been sent to watch a quiet area. They hadn't been taught compassion. They had been taught to show who was boss. They felt like predators on the loose. There were no cameras, no TV reporters, no body in a bag. Yet, all was quiet, perfect for a little show of power. The first was Sergeant Clark. Cold, harsh, pale to the point of sickness, with a tightly cinched belt and eyes that only smiled when he was humiliating someone. The other was Officer Daniels, larger, with a jaw that was constantly chewing and a disdainful gaze. He said little, but he often looked at people as if they were a pile of meat in a display case, as if he were trying to choose who to work on. They saw her right away. Evelyn was standing by a tree, letting Chester sniff the bark. She wasn't blocking the way, she wasn't breaking the rules, she wasn't doing anything that would warrant a stop, but she just had to be. Black, old, and most importantly, free. Clark stopped and nudged Daniels. "Look, our favorite grandma." Daniels chuckled. "She's hanging around with her dead mutt again. Smells like a dump on the sunny side." Clark pulled out his phone. "We're going to add a new episode to our collection, bro. Dogs and pensioners, back to the ghetto." He started recording. The camera shook in his hands with laughter. "Attention, citizens," he began, his diction exaggerated. "An unknown subject, potentially dangerous, was spotted this morning, armed with the scent of mothballs and accompanied by an aggressive Abraxas mutt. Please keep your distance, especially white women and decent taxpayers." Laughter. Loud, brazen. Loud on purpose so she could hear. Evelyn didn't turn around. She kept walking as if they didn't exist. But it was like blood in the water. The silence spurred them on. The calm. It felt like a challenge, and they decided they had to answer. "Wait, I want to talk to her," Daniel said. "I'm in a great mood. Why not have some fun?" He took a step forward. Then another. Clark followed, still filming. "Good morning, madam," he called out with false goodwill. "Oh, excuse me. I'm not sure if I can call you madam. This is cultural identity violence, isn't it?" She stopped. She turned slowly. Evelyn's eyes met the lens of the phone. "Put that away," she said calmly. Clark burst out laughing. "What? This wonderful crime recording instrument? I'm just taking down evidence of you. Yes, you, violating the public spaces ordinance. You look like you slept in a dumpster last night and your dog came straight from the basement." "Are you still taking notes?" she asked again. "Do you still think your opinions mean anything?" he replied. "Jesus, have you ever looked in the mirror?" Daniels came closer. "I've seen you before, by the way. You used to work at the old school, right? Like a teacher, right? You know, they teach us to respect our elders, but honestly, I'd rather see someone like you outside my window than on the sidewalk in front of my lot." He leaned closer to Chester. "What is it? A flea carrier? We should call the paramedics. Who knows what he's sick with? You do realize you're spreading disease, right?" Evelyn said nothing. Then he straightened up and jerked the leash. The dog whined and tried to resist with his paws. "Let go," she said. "Are you on high ground, Granny?" Clark said, putting his hand on the gun. "If you argue, we'll file a charge of resistance. Everything here is on camera. But, alas, our recordings disappear. Especially when victims don't know how to turn to lawyers." I said let go. This is mine. Who are you to give orders? Clark took a step closer. In your life, probably no one remembers your name. And now think about it. You're a black old woman, without papers for a dog, without relatives, without significance. If you disappear, who will make a fuss? Silence. Even the passers-by slowed their pace, but no one intervened. "Do you want to know who I am?" she asked quietly. He nodded mockingly. "Unless it involves some tale of slavery and Martin Luther's." She looked him straight in the eye, quietly, calmly, and she said, "Remember, this day and this morning, because you'll dream about it." Threatening to arrest. Clark raised his hand, touched his radio. "Central, we have a violent citizen at 7th and Oak. Female, potentially unstable, requesting transport." "Agreed," Daniels added. "Provocative. Dog may be rabid." They didn't wait for an answer. That was enough to justify. One of them reached for her hand. The other started to untie her leash. And then Evelyn suddenly raised her hand. Not to hit. She simply raised it to chest level and said, "I warned you." And almost at the same moment, Clark's radio crackled to life. "All stations, cease engaging with Citizen Evelyn James immediately. Repeat, cease immediately. Remain where you are. SWAT team incoming. Do not take any action. Silence. Wind. That cold wind, like the first time a man realizes he's made a mistake." Clark's face went white. "What?" "Repeat," came over the radio. "This is a direct order from the district. James, the mother. Repeat, the mother of General Michael James. Cease all action immediately." Evelyn didn't move. Chester stood next to her, no longer whining. The officers froze. A second. Another. Then they both slowly let go, and she, still standing straight, turned and walked on. No comment, no complaints, no threats, just past them. And now they were the ones left on the sidewalk, knowing they were part of a story that would be discussed at every level tomorrow. And no TikTok filter would hide their faces. Let's pause for a moment before we continue. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from, whether there were moments in your life that could be similar to what we are talking about. And do not forget to subscribe so as not to miss the continuation. We continue. They did not leave. Although the voice from the radio sounded clear, loud, with an undeniable order, the two young police officers were still standing in front of Evelyn. Between them and her, there were no more than 2 steps. It seemed that time stood still, but inside them, something did not allow them to let go of the situation. Pride, a humiliated ego, the pain that is felt by someone who has felt stronger all his life, and suddenly realized that he just touched something that can crush him. They did not know how to retreat with dignity. People like them did not have a scenario in case the granny suddenly turned out to be the general's mother. But to leave just like that? To fold their arms and let her pass? No. This was not part of their code of street lords, so they decided to drag it out. To look for a pretext. To continue the show, even if it was on the edge. And the longer they stood there, the brighter something dark began to boil inside them. Something that always seethes under a uniform when power is given not to serve, but to suppress. Clark put the phone in his pocket, but he did it reluctantly, as if his weapon had been taken away. He stepped back and lit a cigarette, a violation of internal regulations. But who would complain here? You know, he said, exhaling smoke. Something is bothering me. You, madam, look, let's say, unstable. A lonely old woman talking to a dog, refusing to obey orders, very similar to the behavior of people with mental disorders. Evelyn continued to look at him silently. Her eyes were motionless, like a lake in the calm before a storm. Daniels, catching the mood, stepped closer. He spoke louder, as if he expected someone at the window to hear and take it seriously. And then, look at yourself. Your clothes are old, your jacket is stained, your shoes are clearly out of season. It's possible that you are in a state of social distress, and such people, you know, can be a danger to themselves and others. Especially if they are, he paused, emotionally unstable. And as we know, in some ethnic groups, especially with your history, this is passed down through generations. Depression, rebellion, aggression. It's in the blood, isn't it? He chuckled. Clark took a drag on his cigarette and tossed the butt onto the pavement. We may not detain you yet, but did you know that we have the right to take any citizen in for psychiatric evaluation if we find their behavior suspicious? This is for your own safety. And the safety of others, Daniels added, like the children walking nearby. What if your dog isn't vaccinated? What if you're hallucinating and think he's talking to you? What's that called? Zoo schizophrenia? He laughed. Clark joined in. It was loud, ostentatious laughter, for an audience that wasn't there, to drown out the silence that hung between them and the woman they couldn't bend. But she still said nothing, and that pissed them off more than any screaming. Listen, maybe she's a witch? Clark leaned a little closer. Huh? What do you think? Maybe you're just whispering curses at passers-by. I wouldn't be surprised. People like you used to be burned at the stake, but then again, now we just have Twitter. Or maybe she just lives in her own fantasy world where her son is some kind of general, Daniels added. Tell me honestly, did you make this up yourself? Well, to feel like someone. They laughed again. Chester, who had been standing silently next to his mistress, took a step forward. His ears perked up, the fur on the back of his neck stood on end. He growled, not loudly, muffled, brokenly, as if it were not the growl of a dog, but the voice of something ancient and tired. Oh, easy, Wolf. Daniels pretended to be scared. Or should you go to the cage too? You've both been in the cage for a long time, she said. They just gave you uniforms so you wouldn't notice. Their voices died down. The laughter broke off like a thread. A second of tension, like a knife blade on skin. Then Clark spoke slowly, with venom in every word. You're not afraid, are you? Because you think your son, if you have one, will come in a tank and destroy our property. He came closer. Too close. Listen, I'll tell you something, Granny. You're old, alone. You live in a hole where the walls are see-through and the smell of burning is eternal. No one is interested in your life. They will stop remembering you a week after your death. You are dust on the boots of those who mean something. And if it weren't for an accident, you would already be sitting in handcuffs. But, he leaned over and whispered almost in his ear, I will still find a way to remind you who you are. Evelyn turned to him, slowly, smoothly. Not a single muscle trembled. And you will still remain the one who laughs when no one is looking, the one who is afraid of silence, the one who is needed only until the first mistake. And then you will be replaced, forgotten. Because you are no different from 100 others who wear a uniform without knowing why. He wanted to answer something. He had already raised his hand. perhaps to grab her, or at least to show that he was still in control of the situation. And then, a siren. A sharp, low howl of a car from another street. A second, and a black SUV with a federal license plate appears around the corner. The car brakes sharply. A man in a black suit gets out. No uniform, no insignia. Just coldness in his eyes, and a gait that even those who consider themselves on duty retreat from. "Which of you is Clark? Who is Daniels?" The voice is calm, emotionless, like a surgeon's knife. "It is we," Clark began. The man does not listen. He takes out an ID. Special Oversight Department of the Department of Defense, on the personal order of General Michael James. You are under internal investigation. Your camera has been confiscated. Pending investigation. He turns to Evelyn. "Mrs. James, I apologize for the delay. The car is waiting." And at that moment, in the complete silence where even the wind had died down, Clark took a half step forward and, in a trembling voice, said, Is it true? Your son is that general?" Evelyn looked at him. "My son is a man. You are not." She walked past, slowly, without looking back, with a straight back and that very look that does not need revenge, because it has already said everything. Chester walked quietly next to her, and behind them were two men in uniform, not heroes, not protectors, just two voices, sounding in videos that are now watched by lawyers, journalists, investigators. And now they are being laughed at, but by others, those who were silent before. When a woman becomes a threat just because she walks down the street, it is not an accident. It is a system. When her dog becomes dangerous simply because he belongs to her, it's not alarm, it's an excuse. It was less than a minute after the police car had disappeared around the corner, and everything that should have ended. No, it didn't. The order had been given. The security services had intervened. But the two policemen, their pride crushed, remained standing. And the longer they remained silent, the louder the humiliation screamed in them. And a humiliated person, especially one who is used to feeling like a power, becomes dangerous. And they decided that if they couldn't push from above, they would squeeze from below. On what they thought couldn't respond. On a dog, on an elderly woman. On dignity that, in their opinion, had already been trampled. When Evelyn went out again, an hour later, when it became clear that the intervention was temporary, she wasn't going to fight. She just wanted to finish her usual walk with Chester. Not for the sake of demonstration, not for the sake of memory, simply because she is alive. And life is made up of simple rituals, even when it seems like the whole city is against you, but they were already waiting. Clark leaned on the hood of the patrol car like a predator cloaked in formality. Daniel stood a little further away, his hands behind his back, as if awaiting a command. Their faces were cold, closed. Their eyes were unblinking. They were no longer laughing. Laughter had been replaced by something worse. A principle. "Well, hello again, Mrs. Who are you?" Clark said, coming closer. "How was your walk with the government?" Evelyn said nothing. She only tightened her grip on the leash. "Are you still here?" he continued. "I thought you were already sitting in the limo, or maybe at a NATO conference. No? The street is your place, right?" "I'm walking the dog. It's allowed." "You're in the way." Clark's voice became firmer. "The tenants are complaining. An old woman is wandering around the neighborhood, scaring children. People are worried." "You're lying," she replied. Nobody complained. "Now that's slander against a government official," Daniels interjected, slowly approaching. "And it's also a public nuisance. You're blocking the passage, blocking the sidewalk." They began to approach from both sides. Chester whined and pressed himself against Evelyn's leg. "We have the right to take action if we deem the situation dangerous. And your dog," Clark leaned down, "is not on a leash of the required length. He may not be vaccinated. He may bite someone. And you know that by law, we have the right to remove the threat." He reached out and yanked on the leash. Chester jerked forward, whining. "Stop!" Evelyn's voice broke. "What are you doing?" she screamed. "It's not his fault. He's just a dog. That's not a dog. That's a stray parasite, Clark hissed. Just like his owner. And then Daniels added, no longer hiding his racism or malice. You're trash. They keep you here out of pity. You're not part of this city. You're a failure of the system. Old, black, useless. He looked at the passers-by. No one stopped. People were looking at their phones, as usual, or at the pavement, or at the sky. Anywhere but where the truth was happening. Don't block the passage, Clark repeated loudly. For the record. Get off the street. This is no place for your kind. He yanked the leash again. Chester whined louder. Evelyn lunged to free him. Get your hands off him, she screamed. This is an assault, Daniels shouted. Put your hands up! He pushed her. Not hard, but hard enough to make her stagger back and fall to her knees. Chester thrashed against the taut leash, panicking and trying to bite the plastic buckle. What are you doing? The man finally stopped. A young guy with a backpack. Move aside, citizen, Clark growled. There's an arrest going on here. Arresting who? The guy turned on his phone. A woman with a dog? Seriously? She attacked an officer, Daniels said hoarsely. We're recording resistance. She was just walking down the street, the guy continued filming. This is provocation, Clark said. Move before you get booked for interference. He took one last look at Evelyn. She was shaking, holding Chester in her arms. His heart was pounding beneath her palm, as if it were knocking against his bones. He was scared, but alive. And that, oddly enough, was a victory. Clark backed away. Only then. Only when he realized that the camera was now pointed at him. Consider yourself lucky, he said through gritted teeth. But the street is not for you. Next time you won't get away. They left, into the patrol car, silent as dogs after a shot. But dogs, even they, are often cleaner than those in uniform. Evelyn remained sitting on her knees, hugging the dog, not out of weakness, but out of pain, which there was no one else to bear. She was shaking, but not out of fear, out of anger, which no longer had room inside. The world around her moved on. Cars drove by, people went back to business, but every step, every glance now seemed to her as if through glass. She felt herself becoming invisible again, and there was something more terrible in that than any scream, because the invisible are killed silently, and all she had left was the way home, through the city, where she was once again reminded, you are superfluous. They are always testing how far you can go. It begins with a look, then with a hint, with a half joke laced with contempt, then with a tug on the leash, and then whoever doesn't jump back gets broken. And it doesn't matter if you're a woman or an old woman. Black, old, lonely, you're easy to step on. Evelyn knew they wouldn't stop. Chester trembled under her hand. He felt the tension before it turned into action. His weak little body trembled, but he still stepped between her and the police. An old dog, forgotten by God, but not one who had forgotten his duty. I'm going to ask you not to touch us anymore, she said, restrained but firm. This is not funny anymore. You're breaking the law. The law? Clark asked, grinning. I am the law, now, here. Did you hear her talk? He turned to Daniels. Like a retired judge. Or a teacher whose pension couldn't afford a proper haircut. Or manners, he added. Well, that's always the case with them. As if using long words gives them the right to open their mouths. Do you have cameras? Evelyn asked loudly, looking them in the eye. I'll file a complaint. I'll get you suspended. This is all being recorded. Cameras? Clark laughed. Are you naive? Do you think these cameras don't turn off when they're supposed to? He turned to the car and pretended to press something on the radio. See? No evidence, no crime. And you're just an old woman with a dog, no witnesses, no protection. And no chance, Daniels added, walking slowly toward her. At that moment, she did the only thing she could. She raised her hand in a defensive gesture, purely instinctively, to show, I'm not resisting, I'm not threatening, I just want to be left alone. But they had already crossed that line. Clark stepped forward, fast, rough, and pushed her, in one motion, in the chest. It was not a powerful blow, but it was enough. She lost it. Her leg twisted. She could not grab the leash. It was torn from her fingers. It all happened in one moment. A fall, a short cry, a body that collapsed on the concrete. Her head hit the corner of the curb. A dull, dry sound, with that sound after which the air freezes. She remained lying, unconscious. Chester rushed to her. He barked, shrill, desperate, as if trying to call for help. The small body was shaking. He rubbed his muzzle against his owner's face, whining, sobbing like a dog. Blood trickled down Evelyn's forehead. Slowly, viscous. A red stain crawled across her temple, spreading onto the sidewalk. And passers-by walked by. The woman with the stroller glanced and turned away abruptly, quickening her pace. The guy with the headphones, noticing the body, demonstratively looked at his phone. The man in the suit walked by, clutching a folder to his chest like armor. No one came up. No one asked. No one called an ambulance. Because in this neighborhood, everyone knows. If a black woman is lying there, she might just be drunk, mentally unstable, her own fault. And interfering would be too much of a hassle. Clark stood over her, looking down. Pretending, he said. You know how they do it. All for pity, like the cameras will suddenly turn on. Or maybe it's a setup, Daniels added. Like, they beat up the old lady, so they can complain later, call the press, and get caught. Uh-huh. No blood. Just ketchup. Clark leaned down. He ran his finger down Evelyn's cheek. He looked at the blood on her skin. Real blood. And still, he grinned. It happens. They're all like that, you know. Too fragile to live, but too proud to keep quiet. Do you think she'll wake up? Even if she does, she'll say we beat her. And, as luck would have it, our camera broke. Classic. Laughs. The kind that chills the bones. When men in uniform talk about violence like it's routine, like a procedure, like something to be forgotten by the end of their shift. Chester growled. He stepped between them and Evelyn's body, small, trembling, but with a fierce devotion that was more frightening than a gun. He wasn't whining anymore. He just stood there. Daniels took a step forward. Get that mutt away, he snapped. Leave the dog alone, Clark said. If the camera turns on, the death of an animal will be a bad headline. Then let it scream. And Chester kept barking, heart-rendingly, as if he was calling for a god that even the priests of this neighborhood didn't believe in. More than 2 minutes passed before one of the passers-by took out a phone and called 911, not out of sympathy but out of fear that if something happens, he would be a suspect. 2 minutes later, a siren appeared. An ambulance. The paramedics got out and froze when they saw that there were officers nearby. One of them said briefly, "Fell, slipped, no external factors." "Are you sure?" the doctor asked. "We were standing here. Everything is recorded," Clark lied. "The camera? It's not working, but we are witnesses." "Well," the doctor didn't argue. Weak pulse, loss of consciousness, contusion on the back of the head, possible concussion. She was placed on a stretcher. Chester was thrashing about, unwilling to let go. One of the paramedics allowed him to climb in next to her. Soon the car disappeared around the corner, and everything was quiet again. Only the blood remained on the asphalt. It was not wiped off. It was walked around, as always. And those two got back into the car, started the engine, drove on. New street, new rules. But some things had already changed. Somewhere on a server, a recording of a random passerby was stored. Somewhere in a hospital, a woman lay, whose name was heard in offices where those two would never enter. And the dog sat next to her, still shaking, but did not leave. He knew the street was not for them. Before we continue, let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from, whether there were moments in your life similar to those we talk about. And do not forget to subscribe so as not to miss the continuation. We continue. When Evelyn woke up, her first feeling was strange. The pain in her head was unbearable, and the whole world seemed to be spinning around her. But the worst thing was that she couldn't get up. Someone was holding her hand, and someone was watching. She opened her eyes. The light fell weakly, like an autumn slumber through the dirty window, and immediately a sharp, cruel gaze fell on her. Everything was familiar. The same policemen, the same faces, the same endlessly familiar world, where she was again just an object for a game. Clark stood next to her, still with an irritated expression on his face. He looked at her like dirt that needed to be wiped off the sole of his shoe. Daniels stood a little further away, stone-faced, without any emotion. Only his hand, tightly clutching the radio, as if he was ready to transmit her command. Everything around seemed alien and threatening. There was no one around. Only a couple of benches, a rusty trash can, and them, two policemen who were everywhere and nowhere. She tried to get up, but then she felt someone grab her shoulder roughly and force her back onto the bench. "You're going to have to stay here until we figure out what to do with you," Clark said, a sinister grin playing on his lips. "You can't just walk away like everything's fine. Do you even realize who you're talking to? Did you think we were just going to let you go because you're the general's mother?" Evelyn didn't answer. She could still feel her head weighing heavily on her, but her face didn't show any fear. It was the biggest victory she could allow herself at that moment. She clenched her fingers, trying to fight the pain that wouldn't leave her. "You probably don't understand," Clark continued, leaning toward her. "Did you really think you were important? You're just an old woman with a little dog. Have you forgotten where you live?" Evelyn slowly moved her gaze from his face to the pavement. She couldn't even speak. Questions she already knew the answers to were spinning in her head. But she wasn't going to give in. "Listen, don't make me do this any other way," Daniels said, coming closer. "You have no right to stand your ground. Have you ever met the police, old lady? Do you understand how this works? We're here to maintain order, and if you keep this up, I'm taking you away as mentally unstable, to a mental hospital." "What?" Her voice was weak, but there was a challenge in it. "Are you crazy?" "No," he said, not hiding his grin. "You don't understand what I'm talking about. You're a danger to yourself and others. There's clearly something wrong with your psyche." "A mental hospital, you say?" Evelyn looked at him with bitter irony. "And who are you? Gods?" "To decide who's sane and who's not." "You're nothing," Clark said. "You're just an old woman who thinks her son is going to decide things. But you don't know what's going on in this town, do you? You're just an old woman with a dog who needs to go where she belongs. Not downtown. Not with the people that matter. You and your dog are trash just clogging up the streets." She was exhausted, but she wasn't about to show them that they'd won. "If you can't arrest me, then I don't have to go anywhere," she said, leaning back against the bench. "And I don't need your threats. I can sit here. I have a right to breathe this air." Clark leaned over and grabbed her shoulder. "You have no right to anything," he said heatedly. "You're black, and you're old, and you don't understand what's supposed to be done to your kind. And if you keep insisting on it, I'll show you what real punishment is." She tried to push away, but his hand tightened. Evelyn felt her heart beat faster, her ribcage constricted, as if the air was no longer moving through her lungs. But she wasn't afraid. There was no fear in her eyes. There was desperation. But desperation is not weakness. It is strength hidden behind anger. "Fuck you," she whispered softly. Daniels chuckled, ready to take another step. But then Clark intervened. "Leave her," he said. "No point in wasting your energy on an old woman who doesn't even understand what's happening to her." They stood there, looking at her, their expressions unable to hide their inner contempt. And then she did what would be her last step. She took out her phone. It was scratched, dirty, but it worked. Barely, but it worked. She started dialing. "Put the phone away," Clark screamed. He took a step forward, trying to snatch the phone from her hands. "Are you crazy? You think we care who you are?" She tried to write down their badges again, but Clark violently slapped the phone out of her hands. Evelyn screamed as he pushed her back, sending the phone flying onto the asphalt, digging into the cracks. "What are you doing?" she screamed. "You can't do this. I'll file a complaint." Clark leaned over and looked at her with a smirk. Complaint? To whom? Who are you going to complain to, old lady? We're the ones here deciding what happens to you. Do you realize that we're the ones deciding what happens to you? He stood up slowly, stepping back, and looked back at Daniels. I told you she doesn't know who she's talking to, he said quietly, almost regretfully. Next time, it'll be the loony bin, and believe me, I'll book her in there. Evelyn sat on the bench, her hands clenched into fists. She felt her blood boil. It wasn't despair. It was bitterness. That moment when you realize that your rights mean nothing in this world, that there is no justice for you. But she knew it wouldn't end. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not until the time came. And despite all the humiliation, despite the pain, despite the cold look they sent her, she was still alive. And that was the one thing they couldn't take from her. That was what made her strong. Evelyn sat on the bench, her body numb, her thoughts heavy as lead. Every movement was excruciating. Every look she cast at those two officers seemed more than a challenge. It was a test. Her eyes, dark, deep, unblinking, met theirs, and she didn't look away. This was not a fight, not a moment of despair. It was a moment of silence that held her strength. She didn't scream. She didn't ask for help. There was none of the fear they were trying to instill in her body. No, her breathing was steady. The tension wasn't nervous. It was focused, like before a storm tears through the sky. She knew they wouldn't stop. They would, as always, look for weakness. They would press on until they broke. But they didn't know that behind the silence was not weakness. It was determination, a restraint that could breed disaster. Evelyn sat like a stone in a river, ready to survive despite the storm that was gathering around her. She was not an idealist. She had long ago learned that the world would not be kind to her, but she knew one thing for sure. This pain, this humiliation, would not take her spirit. Clark stood, watching her sit, as if nothing had happened. He didn't know what to do. This was against the rules. He had expected something else. He had expected her to beg for mercy. He had expected her to back down, to look for weaknesses. But that didn't happen. You really don't understand how this works, do you? His voice was a shaky whisper, but there was something menacing about it, like a dictator who was used to being obeyed. You do realize that I could just send you somewhere you can't escape, right? You won't have peace until you beg us not to arrest you. Evelyn looked at him with a look that could have burned, but she said nothing. Silence was her weapon. She never lost control of herself. Daniels, standing to the side, did not take his eyes off her. He was irritated. They were humiliated. And now they did not know what to do. But something in his eyes just gushed. He wanted her to break. He wanted her to bend, like most of the women in his life, like most of the people he had met. For her to finally fall into the net of his insults and admit her mistake. He was ready to repeat everything he had said, but the silence stood like an empty canvas on which there was not a single line that could be erased. Well, are you tired of sitting yet, old girl? Clark asked, stepping forward as if testing her stability. We can wait until you decide what to do. We can easily call the mental hospital, and you will be our patient for some time. Daniels chuckled slightly. He also began to approach, but not as a threat. He was ruthless, like a man who had long been accustomed to humiliating the weak. And although she sat silently, he felt how her eyes seemed to shine with a bright fire that burned out all his confidence. Evelyn clenched her hands into fists, but not from pain. She was not angry. She was not upset. She was simply holding in everything that had not yet been expressed. Something was growing in her chest. She felt it. It was like a storm that was ready to tear apart the heavens. It was neither a complaint nor despair. It was a living, burning feeling that would one day find an outlet. She was not afraid. There was no fear in her body. Pain? Yes, she felt it. But the fear was somewhere far away, in another world, in another time. You think this is just for fun? She asked finally, her voice not shaking. It was firm even, with just a hint of contempt. You think that if you push me away, if you silence me, that you'll become stronger? You're wrong. Clark froze for a second. That was unexpected. He was used to everyone submitting, of course, but not now, not here. You're just old. You don't matter. At your age, you just grow old and die. That's it. In this world, you're irrelevant, old lady. All you can do is close your eyes and just disappear. And I'll tell you how it'll be. They'll just move you out of the way. They'll just make you invisible. Evelyn stood silently, and she knew they weren't the only ones who could be invisible. It wasn't a humiliation. It wasn't an insult. It was nothing more than the empty anxiety of those who did not know what to do when before them was not simple obedience, but a challenge. She felt the heaviness growing inside her reach its peak. She took a step forward, unafraid. Tired, perhaps, but not broken. She stood up, and her movements were precise. This was the moment when she ceased to be the one who was afraid. She was the one who could not be broken. You think I am afraid of your threats? She said, looking up. You are wrong. I am not afraid of you. I am not afraid of anything you can do to me. Do you think you have power? Do you think you can destroy me? I will not remain silent. Clark and Daniels looked at her, dumbfounded. They did not know how to react. There was no familiar confidence in them that had been in their eyes a few minutes ago. She was not simply silent. She stood before them like a person who could not be broken. It wasn't just silence. It was a quiet but powerful resistance. You have no idea what you just did, Clark said, but there was no longer the same confidence in his voice. And I know what I did, she said, not looking away. She turned back to them, unafraid. Evelyn wasn't screaming, wasn't crying. She was just there. It was her victory. Quiet, invisible, but real. Her eyes met theirs, and she knew they wouldn't touch her anymore. They had already realized that she wouldn't disappear. She wouldn't go away. She would be here no matter what. And that was perhaps more terrifying to them than any other protest. Evelyn took another step forward, and there was something so powerful in that step that even the air around her seemed to grow quiet. Don't touch me anymore, she said calmly. And in that moment, her words became stones that pierced everything they had built. The silence that hung in the air was almost palpable. Several seconds passed as Clark and Daniel stood before Evelyn, unsure of what to do. They expected her to beg for mercy again, to start crying again, or to plead with them to stop. But instead, she simply stood there, her face devoid of any emotion. She was silent, as if her words were of no use to them. Daniels took a step back, muttering something inaudible, and Clark looked at her with disdain, his gaze directed to the ground, as if he were trying to find some way out of the situation they had created. But then, right in the middle of the dead silence, Clark's radio crackled to life. It was a sound that made everything inside them clench sharply, the familiar mechanical crackle that they had come to take for granted. But this sound was different. There was something new about it, something unimaginable. It echoed across the empty corner of the street, where there was nothing but the vague heat and heavy grey clouds. Precinct 4, came the voice on the radio, raspy and clear as never before. Have you made contact with a female named Evelyn James? Don't let her go. There was a pause. Clark and Daniels exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of what was happening. This was so different from what they were used to. No instructions, no standard directions, no judgment. They didn't know what to make of that name. What? Clark said, his voice incredulous. He grabbed the radio, trying to figure out what was happening. Is this a joke? It's not a joke, the voice on the other end said, and it was clear now, without irony. You have a female named Evelyn James on site. Don't let her go. Orders from the county. She's a direct target. I repeat, do not let go. Both officers froze. A lightning wave of realization washed over them, but they could not immediately comprehend what had just happened. The woman they had been trying to humiliate minutes ago was now the object of attention from high officials. They could not understand why her name had suddenly become so important, why her name was now so loud. Clark tried to return to himself, but something in his voice became uncertain. We don't know what you're talking about, She's just an old woman with a dog. She's not dangerous." "Leave her where she is," the voice repeated. It became stern. "We warned you. The rest is on your own conscience." Clark took a few steps back. He did not like this conversation. Something was wrong. This situation seemed too confusing to be true. He glanced again at Evelyn, sitting on the bench. She did not look like a threat. She looked like someone no one wanted to mess with. An old woman with a dog. Nothing more. But her name hung in the air now, like a vague threat, and something about it was frightening. "Do you know what that means?" Daniels turned to Clark. His eyes narrowed as he realized something was wrong. He'd always thought they could do anything to people like her. No one ever asked questions. But now there was something different. A voice inside him began to whisper that they might have been following the wrong lead. "So who the hell is she?" Clark screamed, losing his patience. "We just stopped her. She's not doing anything illegal." "Shut up and do as you're told," the voice on the radio replied coldly. Clark's heart sank. He felt his confidence begin to crumble, as if someone had violently slapped the map he'd been following out of his hands. He looked at Daniels, who just shook his head. And they both knew that nothing would be the same. They had no choice. They were like toys in the hands of a higher power, and now they had to follow orders without asking questions. Meanwhile, Evelyn remained sitting on the bench, oblivious to their worries. She sat there quietly, almost invisible, in the shadow of these two men, whose thoughts were now in disarray. Their confidence and power were undermined, not because she did anything, but because she didn't give in to their power. She didn't become another victim. Her silence was the biggest punishment they could get. She didn't fall to her knees. She didn't beg for mercy. She didn't make threats. She just sat there and was herself. And that pissed them off, because they couldn't beat her. They couldn't break her. "Damn, what the—" Clark looked at Daniels again. He felt like this was slipping out of his control. He was a cop. He was used to power, but now his power was worthless. "Why are you holding her?" Daniels finally snatched the radio from Clark's hands and continued quietly, but with fury in his voice. "She didn't do anything to slow us down. She didn't threaten us. You see, she's just an old black woman with a dog. This is ridiculous." But Clark was silent, his eyes blank. He didn't know what to do. That was the moment he felt himself losing control of the situation. And suddenly, everything around him became 1,000 times more dangerous than it had been 5 minutes ago. Everything had seemed the same: the street, the bench, and the old woman with the dog. But now this situation was something else. Then the radio went off again, and that sound was the last straw. "Clark, Daniels, listen to me. This is no ordinary woman. Evelyn James is the mother of General Michael James. She is under federal protection. She is under our orders. Maintain order and do not cause trouble, or you will be held accountable." That moment, when the bench, the sidewalk, and this entire dirty street corner suddenly became part of a completely different game. And in that moment, although Clark and Daniels didn't know what to do, they still felt it. They were wrong. Evelyn James, a name they had not seen. A person who was much more important than just an old woman with a dog. You, Daniels finally said, but he couldn't continue. "Let's just let her go," Clark said, now without his previous confidence. "Quickly, before it's too late." Evelyn stood up, slowly, not out of fear, just because she knew her time had come. She walked past the police officers, without even a glance at them, and headed toward the street, where her transport was already waiting. And the two of them stood there, dumbfounded. All they could do was watch her disappear into the horizon, but for them, this was not the end. It was the beginning. Before we continue, let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories, whether there were moments in your life similar to those we tell you about, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the rest. We continue. It all happened so fast that Clark didn't even have time to realize what was happening. His mind was still spinning, thinking about how they had screwed up the operation, how they had tried pointlessly to bully the old woman into submission, and now they were part of something that was completely outside their normal sense of power. When Evelyn left without a word, they stood there for a few minutes, stunned. A slight panic gripped Clark. He had never been prepared for such an unexpected turn of events. He was a cop, and every day he controlled everything that happened in his area. But what had happened to him today was unsettling. And then he showed up. A black SUV, with clearly government plates, pulled up slowly to the curb, stopping a few feet from the patrol car. There was some power about it, something independent of the police that they couldn't ignore. A man in a sharp black suit, looking impeccable, got out. He was tall, with cold eyes that looked at Clark and Daniels without emotion or doubt. This man was not just an agent, but rather the one who controlled everyone below. He did not introduce himself, but he immediately adopted a commanding tone. "Which one of you is Clark? Which one is Daniels?" His voice was deep, sharp, and precise, as if he could squeeze out each word to the millimeter. The officers froze. This was not an ordinary federal agent. This was not the kind of person they were used to working with. He was more than just a man in a uniform. He was someone who radiated authority. He made Clark and Daniels look like boys on a school recess. Clark took a step forward, but he didn't know what to say. His voice was tight, almost nervous. We don't know who he is. He's just an old lady with a dog. Nothing out of the ordinary. We were following standard procedure." The man in the suit did not answer right away. He pulled out his ID and showed it, ignoring the fact that they hadn't reacted properly. "My name is Grayson," he said, and there was no excitement in his voice, only absolute confidence. "I'm here on assignment. The woman you just interacted with is Evelyn James. Cease all activity, immediately." He glanced at them, and Clark felt his entire world begin to shrink. That gaze was cold and impartial, like an icy wind. Grayson didn't make a single unnecessary movement. He knew that they simply didn't understand what they were dealing with. "That's impossible," Daniels muttered, trying not to show his confusion. "She's just an old woman. We pulled her over for a routine check. She doesn't have any rights." "She has every right," Grayson replied, his tone level, but each sentence he spoke sounded like a death sentence. "Her son is General Michael James. You have no right to touch her. Everything you have done is now subject to review, and I strongly advise you not to interfere further." There was a complete rejection of any possibility of further conversation in those words. Grayson looked at them as if they were petty crooks. There were no threats, no aggression. Everything was said calmly, but there was more power in what he said than anything they had ever heard from their superiors. Clark and Daniels exchanged glances. They could not understand what was happening. How was this possible? How could this woman, insignificant in their opinion, be connected with such a high official? They had no explanation for it, but their vague attempts at justification met with even greater coldness. "If I were you," Grayson continued, "I would leave the station now. Right away, before it was too late. There was no need for threats. That was enough." He left them with those words, and everyone knew. They were too petty to participate in this game. All they could do was comply. And comply they did. Grayson turned away without waiting for an answer. He walked back to his SUV, his contempt undisguised. He had what it took to get them out of the way. He was the one in charge, and they knew it. A few minutes later, the federal-issued car drove away, leaving the two officers standing on the sidewalk. Clark and Daniels didn't move. They were trying to process what had happened, but all they knew was that there was something very important and hidden behind all of this, and they were just pawns. Evelyn James, the woman with the dog they had humiliated, the one they had tried to destroy, had become someone else entirely. Someone important, not just to them, but to an entire system they seemed to know nothing about. Clark felt helpless, even as he tried to maintain his composure. His inner pride had been destroyed. He had not just been humiliated, he had been taken out of his reality. Daniels didn't know what to say. His mind was all in a tangle. He'd thought their job was to keep order, that they could do whatever they wanted. But now that confidence was shattered, He saw how quickly things could change. Clark looked away. Evelyn had disappeared into the shadows, her figure obscured by the car. She was gone, and they were out on the street, out of sight. In that moment, Clark felt like he had lost control, that his life, his career, everything he'd ever thought was right, was now rising into the air like smoke from a fire. What do you think about this? Daniels asked, not knowing who or what he was asking. It sounded like he was trying to reclaim something that was already gone. Clark was silent. Silence was all that was left. Evelyn James was gone. But her presence was not just in their heads now. It was on a level of power, a level they couldn't understand and couldn't control. The shadow she had gone into wasn't just a physical movement. It was a shadow that was now upon them. Clark stood there, still processing what had happened, when Grayson disappeared around the corner. His thoughts were in a tangle. He was trying to find a rational explanation for what had just happened. His mind was trying to find some kind of logic to it, but it all came back to the same thing. He and Daniels had made a mistake. More specifically, they had pulled on a thread that was now unraveling an entire web. They were embroiled in something far more dangerous than just a simple law enforcement matter. This isn't just a woman, Clark. You should have known that, he thought. But it was too late. Now they were standing here in the blazing sun, with no answers. Regular cops, now part of a game where their words and actions no longer mattered. Behind them stood not just a force, but a system that could wipe them off the face of the earth in a second. Several minutes of silence passed when the radio hissed again, and this sound again brought them out of their stupor. "Precinct number 4, said the same stern voice they had heard before. "You did not understand the importance of the situation. Attention. We know you have been in contact with Evelyn James, but as I said, she is not an ordinary citizen. Attention. She is the mother of General Michael James. Cease all actions. You have violated regulations. Take immediate action." The policeman could not believe what they were hearing. Clark clutched the radio in his hands and his fingers began to tremble. He looked back at Daniels. Their eyes met. It was the moment when they realized they did not know who they had contacted. Those words, that name, they couldn't be real. Michael James. The words died in their ears. Daniels actually took a step back. Thoughts of what it could mean raced through his mind. General Michael James, one of the most powerful men in the country, head of the intelligence services, recently returned from a secret mission. He had connections, power, and absolute immunity. His name wasn't just words. It was a symbol. It was leverage that could break any system. Did we mess with him? Daniels said, his voice shaking with realization. Clark stood there, unsure of what to do. His eyes were blank, but his insides were turning over. He knew who General Michael James was. He knew how many people there were who were afraid to even say his name out loud. He knew that he could destroy their careers in a second, and this was obviously just the beginning. "You don't understand what you've done," the voice on the radio continued, and it was no longer just a threat, but a cold, confident determination. "You've humiliated a man who matters in this system, a system that, as you can see, is much bigger than your little police station. This is no longer just a fine for a violation. This is a serious offense with consequences you don't even realize." Clark opened his mouth, but he couldn't find the words. He was trapped, and everything he knew was useless. They had no way to undo what they'd done. The mistake they'd made wasn't just a disciplinary sanction. It was a greater game they weren't even in. They were pawns, and the generals were the ones moving the pieces. "Your actions weren't just a gross violation, they were an insult." The voice was like ice. "You didn't just stop a woman, you humiliated her. Evelyn James is not just someone's mother, she's part of something much bigger. And if you want to keep doing your job, you're going to have to learn who to mess with, and who not to." In those moments, Clark realized that everything they'd thought was wrong. They'd been convinced that the system was just their power on the streets. They didn't know that there were people in that system who made all the decisions on another level. And they were just grains of sand in that vast machine. "Leave her alone," the voice on the radio said. and this time there was confidence in its tone, as if everything had been decided. "Do not try to follow her or interfere. This is a warning. Your last warning." The radio went silent again, and silence fell upon them. Clark clenched his fists, his knuckles white with the strain. He couldn't believe what had happened. Evelyn James, the woman with the dog they'd tried to humiliate, was now part of a greater game that had consumed them, and they didn't even know how much they'd hurt her. Daniel stood there speechless. His mind was racing, his body tense. He tried to rationalize. He tried to tell himself that everything that had happened was an accident, but he knew it wasn't. He knew they'd just attracted the attention of people who weren't to be trifled with. "Do you realize what we just did?" Daniels asked, his voice shaking. We humiliated her. We tried to destroy her. And now her son." "I know," Clark said, his voice weary. "We were wrong. We didn't think it would turn out like this." It sounded like an admission, but it didn't bring relief. It couldn't change what had already happened. The name Evelyn James had become a curse to them, and now they were a part of something they didn't understand. "We have to get out of here," Clark said, "and we can't tell anyone about this." Daniels nodded silently. They both knew their lives would never be the same. They had been wrong, and now they were beyond the line they could not cross. The siren in the distance rang out again, but it was no longer a normal sound. It was like an ominous sign that they had embarked on a path of no return. The street they stood on was no longer the same. Evelyn James had disappeared from their sight, but she had left an indelible mark on their souls, and they knew that her name would haunt them now. There was no place for them in this world. They were simply unnecessary. No matter how they tried to justify their actions, they had already become a part of it all. And there was no turning back. Before we continue, let us take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from, whether there were moments in your life similar to those we tell you about. And do not forget to subscribe so as not to miss the continuation. We continue. Evelyn silently stood up. It was obvious that every movement she made was difficult for her. The bruise on her face was another mark on her fate, another proof that the world she lived in was not for people like her. With every step, her body was in sharp pain, but her eyes remained cold, calm, as if nothing had happened. She did not look at the police officers standing in front of her. She did not seek sympathy, did not try to justify herself. She simply walked, not paying attention to those who, just a few minutes ago, tried to destroy her dignity, breaking her body and soul with their ridicule and humiliation. To them, she was just an old woman with a dog, whose existence was not worth paying attention to. But now, they stood before her like children caught red-handed. Clark and Daniel stood, unable to look away. They could not understand what was happening. All they knew was that they were no longer in control of the situation. This turn was something that did not belong to their world. They thought they were the masters of this game, but now, standing in front of the woman they had humiliated, they felt the ground shift beneath their feet. Evelyn, with her straight back and cold gaze, was like a rock that would not crumble, no matter how hard they tried. The silence was deafening. Each of the policemen knew that he could not justify his actions. They understood that they had not simply broken the code. They had broken everything they believed to be right. They had insulted not just a person, but the system they thought they were protecting. Evelyn did not say a word. She kept walking, her steps confident, as if none of this concerned her. That was what they could not understand. She was stronger than all of them, and she did not want to be part of their world. When she reached the corner, she finally stopped. The policemen did not move. They stood as if in a daze and continued to watch her walk away. Each of them knew that their defeat was deeper than just a mistake. They had been wrong about who they had humiliated, and now they realized that those who seemed weak could be much stronger than they thought. Don't you understand what you've done?" Clark finally said, but his voice was empty, without strength. Evelyn did not answer. She kept walking. She did not wait for their confessions. Her silence was the answer to everything. She was not one to make excuses for others' mistakes. She did not have to make excuses. It was their fault, Their mistake, and they had to live with it. Daniels looked at his partner, then at the ground. He did not know what to say. He wanted to say something that would give him back control, something that would hide his own confusion. But nothing worked. He watched her leave, and he knew she would not return. She was a stranger to them already, a stranger in this world where they were the rulers, and this humiliated them even more than any order they had given. Everything changed in their eyes. They no longer looked at her as an old woman who could be humiliated and ignored. They saw before them the mother of one of the most powerful men in the country. They saw a woman who held power behind her that they could not cope with, and there was no anger in their eyes, no contempt that they had felt before. There was something else: uncertainty, confusion, shame. They understood that they had made a mistake, but they did not know how to get out of it. Evelyn did not stop. She did not seek their forgiveness. She did not seek consolation. She knew that they would not understand her, and not because she was better than them, but because she was different. And in this was her greatness. She was a person who, despite humiliation, did not lose her strength. She was a woman who had experienced much more than they could imagine, but now they realized they would never be able to understand her. They could humiliate her 1,000 times, but her inner world was inaccessible to them, and it destroyed them. It gave them no peace. Evelyn walked without looking back. She did not seek justice. She did not ask them for help. She simply walked forward, and each step she took was like a blow to their consciousness. These steps were her answer, the answer to everything they had tried to do. At that moment, when she disappeared around the corner, Clark and Daniels were left standing like two lost people. All they could do now was watch, and that was worse than any punishment. Evelyn was not an enemy to them. She was not someone to fight. She was simply someone who had not been defeated. The policemen stood there for a few more minutes, not knowing what to do. They tried to justify their actions, but the more they thought about it, the more obvious one simple fact became: they were wrong. Everything they had done had been a mistake. And now they were faced with a reality they couldn't escape. But the worst part was that they couldn't undo their mistake. All that was left was silence, and in that silence, they felt even more helpless. Then Clark turned and walked back to his car without a word. Daniels followed, unsure of what they were supposed to do now. And though neither of them said it out loud, they had lost their power, but it was obvious. It was in their faces. It was in the way they moved. They were no longer the ones who decided. They were the ones who obeyed. And that lesson was more painful than any reprimand. And in that moment, as they walked back to their cruiser, they knew they would never be the same again. They had seen the other side of humiliation, the one where you stay on the field no matter what has been done to you, the side they couldn't understand until they were face to face with it. Evelyn was gone, but her shadow remained, and they knew it wasn't just her shadow. It was the shadow of their own pride, a shadow that would haunt them to the end. Evelyn didn't say a word. She silently picked up Chester, who stood next to her like a small, pathetic shadow of what had been her entire world just a few minutes ago. She took a firm grip on the leash and walked forward slowly, step by step, as if nothing that had happened mattered. Or maybe because everything that had happened was part of her life, part of a story in which she was not going to be listened to. But she no longer looked back. Each step she took sounded like an inevitable blow, like a response to everything that had happened to her. She took her time, but her movements were confident. She knew that all her attempts to find an excuse for these policemen would be in vain. They had already chosen their side, and now they had to pay for their actions. As she walked down the sidewalk, the police officers stood motionless, unable to move. It was as if some invisible, elusive burden was now hanging over them. They could no longer maintain that facade of confidence, because they were so close to their own shattered pride that nothing could hold them back. Clark and Daniel stood and looked at her, trying to understand what had just happened. Evelyn was gone, and with her, their faith in their own power was slipping away. They, two armed men, had fallen before a woman, old and invisible. They had lost their faces. It couldn't be true, Clark thought. He watched her go, And in his mind, he wondered how such a woman could be anything other than a helpless victim. How could her gaze be so powerful? There had been many like her in his life, homeless, lost to existence. But she was different. It was in her look, in her walk, in her silence. But the most terrible thing was that this silence seemed louder than a scream. It sounded as if it did not require proof, as if his silence was the most powerful weapon. And now the police did not know how to react. They seemed to be standing in the void, not understanding what was supposed to happen next. Evelyn walked calmly. She did not hurry, but she did not slow down either. She walked with what remained in her heart, with what did not disappear, despite all the humiliations she went through. Restraint, inhale and exhale. She did not need words, because her actions were brighter than any phrases. She knew that they were looking at her, but in her eyes there was neither hatred nor a desire for revenge. She did not seek revenge, she just walked. Chester, growling quietly, walked next to her, also feeling this heavy atmosphere that hung over the city. He was her only friend, her only support at this moment. It was all too much for him. He was old, his paws were failing, but he followed his mistress, followed her path without asking questions. The police stood behind him, and the scene haunted them. Clark felt anxiety growing in his chest. Daniels looked at him, unable to find words. He seemed to search their actions for an answer. But he knew. They were not up to the task. They were under the system's fingernails, and all they could do was obey. And yet, somehow, Evelyn did not ask for forgiveness, did not beg for mercy. She just walked. This was strange to them. Right under their noses was all the power they had no idea about. Clark walked up to Daniels and said quietly, "We were wrong. We shouldn't have treated her like that. It wasn't right." Daniels didn't answer right away. He stood there, watching Evelyn walk away. But now he didn't see her as someone to be hurt. He saw her as someone who could destroy everything they were trying to build. She was stronger than them. It was terrifying. It was obvious. "Yes," Daniels said finally. "We were all wrong, but it wasn't just us. We didn't know who we were dealing with. We just didn't understand." He didn't finish the sentence because they both knew that was no excuse. It was all too obvious. Wrong. Harsh. And then there was silence again. A long, heavy silence. But it wasn't frightening. It was empty. Strange. Impossible. Then, far away, at the end of the street, came the sound of a siren. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it quickly grew louder. It was a sound the police had heard 1,000 times, but it sounded different today. It was hard and unyielding, like a harbinger of something that could not be stopped. Clark turned his head toward the sound and felt his body tense. He knew that the sound had nothing to do with them. It was not an ordinary patrol car. It was something else. Suddenly, he realized that another black SUV was appearing at the intersection ahead. It was even more menacing, with nondescript license plates and windows like glass, reflecting the light. The car stopped a few meters away. Another man in a black suit got out. He looked like the one who had arrived earlier, but his steps were faster, more confident. Grayson. Yes, it was him. He approached Clark and Daniels with the same stern expression on his face, the same invisible pressure he had brought into their lives. "Let's talk," he said coldly, without waiting for an answer. "We were wrong. I told you not to mess with Evelyn James. She's more than just the general's mother. She's the key to matters you don't understand." Grayson didn't say another word. He turned and pointed at the car. Clark and Daniels couldn't understand what they'd just heard. They wanted to protest. They wanted to say something that would justify their actions, but they couldn't. The words wouldn't come out. Evelyn was gone, but her presence still hung in the air like a heavy, suffocating smog. There was no longer any certainty in the police officers' eyes. They didn't see the power in this world. They were no longer the ones who made decisions. Evelyn James. She was more than just a person. She was a symbol of something greater, something they couldn't understand. It was too late. Grayson, without another word, simply turned and walked away, leaving them alone with their shame. Evelyn was gone. But she left something far more important. A lesson they could not forget. A lesson about how much in the world still depends on a name, and how little they really understood about this world. And at that moment, when the last sound of the siren died down, the police officers stood and were silent. Silent in the shadow left by the woman who didn't need words to win. What do you think about this story? Leave your thoughts in the comments. It's very important for us to know your opinion. Have you had similar cases in your life? Have you encountered racism or injustice? Your comments and experiences are very valuable to us. We sincerely appreciate each of you. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video. Your likes and subscriptions give us the strength to continue doing what we do. Have you a nice day. Write the phrase, "I'm not silent," in the comments so that we know that you listened to the end.